When the federal government decided to take down one of America's most feared motorcycle clubs, they never expected the real destruction would come from within. The Mongols Motorcycle Club survived decades of rivalry, violence, and law enforcement pressure, only to be nearly destroyed by a drunk phone call and a wife's revenge. What happened next shocked everyone involved and changed motorcycle club history forever. The foundation of power, how Lil Dave built his empire.
Lil Dave had to maintain order and resolve conflicts between members. It was a delicate balance of showing strength and keeping everyone united. He had to make tough decisions, sometimes putting the club's interests above personal friendships. Despite the challenges, Lil Dave thrived in his role. He was respected and feared, both within the club and in the larger motorcycle club.
The Mongols Motorcycle Club wasn't some weekend riding group that got out of hand. This organization emerged from the gritty streets of East Los Angeles in the late 1960s, when Hispanic bikers found themselves largely shut out of the predominantly white Hells Angels. What started as a response to exclusion eventually grew into one of the most feared and respected outlaw motorcycle clubs in the world. David Santillan, known to everyone as Lil Dave, didn't stumble into leadership by accident. When he took control of the Mongols, the club was facing an identity crisis. Years of internal conflicts, legal pressures, and a lack of clear direction had left many members questioning what it meant to wear the Mongols patch. The club had drifted away from its core identity, the brotherhood of the road, the thunder of Harley engines, and the unbreakable bonds forged through shared rides and mutual respect. But here's what nobody knew at the time. This rebuilding effort would eventually put Lil Dave in a position where a single conversation would destroy everything he worked to build. The very success he created would become the foundation for suspicions that would tear the club apart from within. Lil Dave recognized that the club needed to get back to basics. His first major initiative was bringing back the monthly motorcycle rides and runs that had been abandoned during the chaos of previous years. These weren't just casual weekend rides, they were organized events that brought members from different chapters together, reinforcing the idea that despite their various illegal activities, they were first and foremost motorcyclists. The rumble of dozens of bikes rolling down the highway in formation sent a clear message to both rival clubs and law enforcement. The Mongols were united, and they weren't going anywhere. The restructuring went far beyond organizing rides. Lil Dave understood that respect in the outlaw motorcycle world came through a combination of fear and admiration. He began establishing strict protocols for how members conducted themselves, both within the club and in public. Discipline became a cornerstone of his leadership style, but it wasn't the kind of harsh authoritarianism that crushes spirits. Instead, he created a system where loyalty was rewarded and disloyalty was punished swiftly and decisively. Under his guidance, the Mongols developed a sophisticated hierarchy that rivaled any corporate structure. Each chapter had clear leadership roles, and communication between different regions became streamlined and efficient. This organizational approach allowed the club to coordinate activities across multiple states, while maintaining the tight-knit feel that made motorcycle clubs appealing to members seeking brotherhood and belonging. The transformation wasn't just internal. Lil Dave understood that in the outlaw motorcycle world, perception was everything. He worked to cultivate an image of the Mongols as serious, professional, and not to be underestimated. This meant paying attention to details that other club leaders might overlook: how members dressed at public events, how they interacted with law enforcement during traffic stops, and how they conducted themselves in bars and other establishments where rival clubs might be present. This careful attention to image management helped the Mongols gain respect from other outlaw motorcycle clubs. In a world where reputation could mean the difference between peaceful coexistence and violent conflict, Lil Dave's approach was both practical and effective. The club began to be seen as a major player in the outlaw motorcycle scene, capable of holding its own against established organizations like the Hells Angels and the Outlaws. The success of these efforts became evident in how other clubs began to treat the Mongols. What had once been dismissive attitudes toward the relatively younger organization shifted to cautious respect. Invitations to major motorcycle events and rallies began arriving more frequently. Other club leaders started reaching out to establish territorial agreements and mutual respect pacts. For Lil Dave, these developments represented validation that his approach was working. Yet success in the outlaw motorcycle world comes with its own set of challenges. As the Mongols grew in power and influence, they also attracted more attention from law enforcement agencies. The FBI, ATF, and local police departments began dedicating more resources to monitoring club activities. This increased scrutiny would eventually become a constant presence in the lives of Mongols members, influencing everything from where they met to how they communicated with each other. This growing law enforcement attention would eventually lead to a relationship that nobody could have predicted. One between Lil Dave and a federal agent that would ultimately provide his enemies with the weapon they needed to destroy him. Navigating the dangerous waters of outlaw culture. Leading an outlaw motorcycle club requires a unique set of skills that most people never have to develop. Lil Dave found himself constantly balancing competing demands and pressures that would have crushed a less determined leader. On one side were his own members, each with their own personalities, ambitions, and problems. Some were weekend warriors who joined for the camaraderie and image, while others were hardcore criminals who saw the club as cover for their illegal activities. Managing these different types of members required diplomatic skills that would have been valuable in any organization. Lil Dave had to keep the weekend riders engaged and feeling valued, while ensuring that the more criminally inclined members didn't bring unnecessary heat down on the entire organization. This balancing act played out in countless small decisions: which events to attend, which territories to claim, how to respond to provocations from rival clubs, and when to push back against law enforcement pressure. The threat from rival clubs was constant and multifaceted. The Hells Angels, with their decades of experience and international reach, viewed the growing influence of the Mongols with suspicion and occasional hostility. Territorial disputes could escalate from heated words to violence with little warning. Bar fights, highway confrontations, and even attacks on clubhouses were all part of the reality that Lil Dave had to navigate. These conflicts weren't just about pride or machismo, though those elements were certainly present. Control of territory often meant control of lucrative illegal activities, drug distribution networks, protection rackets, and illegal gambling operations. When the Mongols expanded into new areas, they weren't just claiming symbolic territory, they were potentially disrupting established criminal enterprises that other organizations had spent years developing. The complexity of these relationships meant that Lil Dave had to become something of a diplomat, in addition to being a club leader. Negotiations with other clubs required careful attention to protocol and respect. A wrong word or perceived insult could trigger conflicts that might result in serious injury or death for members on both sides. The stakes of these interactions were always high, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Law enforcement pressure added another layer of complexity to every decision. Federal agencies like the ATF and FBI had made it clear that they viewed outlaw motorcycle clubs as ongoing criminal enterprises rather than legitimate organizations. This meant that perfectly legal activities could be viewed with suspicion and scrutinized for potential criminal connections. Club meetings, rides, and social events all had to be planned with the assumption that law enforcement might be watching. The pressure extended to individual members as well. Traffic stops became opportunities for police to gather intelligence about club activities. Members found themselves under surveillance, with their movements tracked and their associates identified. Some members were approached by law enforcement officers, hoping to turn them into informants. The constant pressure created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that Lil Dave had to manage carefully to prevent it from destroying the club from within. Prison was always a possibility for club leaders and members. Many Mongols found themselves facing charges for everything from minor drug offenses to serious violent crimes. Lil Dave himself served time, an experience that gave him credibility with members who valued toughness and the ability to handle whatever consequences came with the outlaw lifestyle. His willingness to accept responsibility and serve his time without complaint reinforced his position as a leader who wouldn't ask his members to take risks he wasn't willing to take himself. But what Lil Dave didn't realize was that every interaction with law enforcement, every conversation with federal agents, every attempt to manage conflicts diplomatically was being watched and recorded by people who would later use these very efforts against him. The federal government was building a case that would threaten not just individual members, but the entire existence of the organization. The federal noose tightens. The federal government's interest in the Mongols didn't develop overnight. What began as routine monitoring of a regional motorcycle club gradually evolved into one of the most extensive and prolonged investigations in the history of outlaw motorcycle club enforcement. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives took the lead, dedicating enormous resources to understanding and ultimately dismantling what they viewed as a criminal organization masquerading as a motorcycle club. The investigation that would eventually threaten the very existence of the Mongols began with small-scale operations focused on individual members suspected of specific crimes. Drug dealers, weapons traffickers, and suspected participants in violent crimes found themselves under surveillance and investigation. What law enforcement agencies began to notice was a pattern. Many of these criminals were also Mongols members, and their illegal activities seemed to be coordinated through club structures and relationships. Federal investigators developed a theory that would drive their approach for more than a decade. The Mongols weren't just a motorcycle club whose members happened to commit crimes, but rather a criminal organization that used the motorcycle club structure to facilitate and conceal illegal activities. This distinction was crucial because it opened the door to using powerful federal laws designed to combat organized crime. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO, became the primary weapon in the federal arsenal against the Mongols. Originally created to fight the mafia and other traditional organized crime groups, RICO allows prosecutors to charge individuals not just for specific crimes they committed, but for participating in a pattern of racketeering activity as part of a criminal enterprise. For outlaw motorcycle clubs, this meant that being a member could potentially be treated as participation in a criminal conspiracy. Building a RICO case requires extensive evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise, which meant that federal investigators needed to document not just individual crimes, but the organizational structure that allegedly facilitated those crimes. This requirement led to years of surveillance, wiretapping, and infiltration efforts designed to understand how the Mongols operated from the inside. Undercover operations became a central component of the investigation. TF agents spent months or even years building false identities and working their way into the confidence of Mongols members. These operations were dangerous and complex, requiring agents to participate in club activities while secretly gathering evidence of criminal behavior. The psychological toll on undercover agents was enormous, as they had to maintain their false identities while witnessing and sometimes participating in illegal activities. The scope of surveillance was breathtaking. Phone conversations were recorded, text messages were monitored, and email communications were analyzed. Physical surveillance teams tracked the movements of club leaders and members. Financial records were scrutinized for evidence of money laundering and unexplained income. Even social media posts and photographs were collected and analyzed for evidence of criminal activity. This level of investigation required coordination between multiple federal agencies as well as state and local law enforcement. The complexity of managing such a large-scale operation while maintaining security and preventing leaks was enormous. Hundreds of law enforcement personnel were involved in various aspects of the investigation over the years it took to build the case. The human cost of this extended investigation was significant for everyone involved. Mongols members and their families lived under constant surveillance, never knowing when they might be arrested or when their homes might be raided. The stress of this situation took a toll on relationships and mental health throughout the organization. Some members left the club rather than continue living under such pressure, while others became increasingly paranoid and suspicious of anyone who might be cooperating with law enforcement. For the federal agents involved, the investigation became a consuming obsession that dominated their professional lives. Agent John Sun, who would later become a central figure in the controversy surrounding Lil Dave, spent years of his career focused almost exclusively on the Mongols. The depth of his knowledge about the organization and its members was both an asset to the investigation and ultimately a source of complications that no one could have anticipated. Little did anyone know that this extensive investigation would eventually create the conditions for the club's most devastating betrayal, not from an undercover agent or turned informant, but from within the organization itself, triggered by personal relationships gone wrong. The relationship that changed everything: Lil Dave and Agent Sun. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, few relationships are as complex and potentially dangerous as those between club leaders and the law enforcement agents assigned to investigate them. The relationship between Lil Dave and ATF agent John Sun evolved over years of investigation and surveillance into something that defied easy categorization. What began as a typical adversarial relationship between a criminal suspect and a federal agent gradually developed into something more complicated, ultimately becoming the source of accusations and suspicions that would destroy Lil Dave's leadership and threaten his life. Agent Sun had been investigating outlaw motorcycle clubs for most of his career, but the Mongols case became his specialty and in many ways his obsession. He studied the organization with the intensity of an academic researcher, learning not just about their criminal activities, but about their culture, traditions, and internal dynamics. His knowledge of the club was encyclopedic, extending to details about individual members' personalities, family relationships, and personal histories. This deep knowledge made Sun incredibly effective as an investigator, but it also created an unusual dynamic in his interactions with club members, particularly Lil Dave. Unlike other law enforcement officers who treated all Mongols members as criminals to be arrested, Sun developed what he described as a professional respect for the organizational aspects of the club and for Lil Dave's leadership abilities. The relationship between the two men developed gradually over years of encounters at various motorcycle events, court proceedings, and during the execution of search warrants. What started as grudging mutual respect evolved into something that resembled a professional relationship between adversaries who understood and even appreciated each other's skills and dedication to their respective causes. Lil Dave recognized that Sun was different from other federal agents. Where most law enforcement officers treated him with barely concealed contempt, Sun maintained a professional demeanor that acknowledged Lil Dave's intelligence and organizational abilities. This respectful treatment was unusual enough to be noteworthy in the outlaw motorcycle world, where most interactions with law enforcement were characterized by mutual hostility. For his part, Sun found in Lil Dave a subject worthy of his professional attention. The Mongols' leader's ability to maintain discipline and loyalty within a large, geographically dispersed organization impressed the agent, even as he worked to gather evidence that would ultimately be used to prosecute that same organization. Sun understood that dismantling the Mongols would require more than just arresting individual members for specific crimes. It would require understanding and disrupting the leadership structure that held the organization together. The practical benefits of their unusual relationship became apparent during various incidents where violence might have erupted between club members and law enforcement. Sun could communicate directly with Lil Dave to defuse potentially dangerous situations, and Lil Dave could use these communications to demonstrate to his members that he was capable of protecting the club's interests through negotiation, rather than just confrontation. These interactions served both men's interests, but also created the foundation for future problems. In the insular world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, any regular communication between a club leader and a federal agent was inherently suspicious. Members who observed these interactions but weren't privy to their content naturally wondered what was being discussed and whether their leader might be sharing information with law enforcement. The complexity of the relationship deepened over time as both men found themselves dealing with personal and professional pressures related to the ongoing investigation. Sun was under pressure from his superiors to produce results from what was becoming one of the most expensive and time-consuming investigations in ATF history. Lil Dave was dealing with increasing suspicion from club members who wondered whether his communications with law enforcement were appropriate for a club leader. Neither man fully understood how their relationship was being perceived by others until it was too late to address the growing concerns. What they viewed as professional communication based on mutual respect, others saw as evidence of inappropriate cooperation. The ambiguous nature of their interactions left room for interpretation, and in the paranoid world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, the worst possible interpretations often gained credence. What nobody realized was that this relationship, built on mutual professional respect and practical necessity, would eventually become the weapon that destroyed both men's reputations and nearly tore apart one of America's most powerful motorcycle clubs. The trial that shook the motorcycle world.
2008, the infamous Black Rain investigation, which you got to remember, we had undercover cops that have been in the club infiltrating for the last 3 years under Doc's reign. And there was 4 of them. It was ugly. They raided. Largo got taken in the raid, 79 defendants. And the whole premise behind these raids was not only to charge people. The charging indictment was obviously the 79 defendants. The icing on the cake was trying to steal the patch from us, the identities, the trademarks. The Mongol top rocker, the center patch with the image of Genghis Khan riding a motorcycle. That was trademarked. Well, what nobody really knew, Doc fucking threw those trademarks under Shotgun Productions and took the trademarks. Part of his bargaining plea agreement was to give the government the trademarks.
You're kidding me.
I'm not, dead ass serious.
So Doc took
Yes.
the Brotherhood's
Yes.
trademark and put it in his own private
Right.
company?
Right.
Wow.
But see, what the government
October 30th, 2018 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most significant legal challenges ever faced by an outlaw motorcycle club. The federal courthouse in Santa Ana, California, became the battleground where prosecutors would attempt to prove that the Mongols Motorcycle Club was not a legitimate organization, but a criminal enterprise that deserved to be dismantled under federal racketeering laws. The scope of the charges was breathtaking in its ambition. Federal prosecutors weren't content to pursue individual members for specific crimes. Instead, they had constructed a case designed to attack the very existence of the organization. The indictment included charges related to murder, drug trafficking, weapons violations, and assault. But the most significant charge was the RICO conspiracy count that painted the entire club as a criminal enterprise. What made this case unprecedented was the government's attempt to seize the club's trademark and intellectual property as proceeds of criminal activity. The Mongols logo, a drawing of a figure resembling Genghis Khan riding a motorcycle, wasn't just a symbol to the club members, it was their identity. The government's position was that this logo had been used to facilitate criminal activity and therefore should be forfeited to the federal government like any other asset derived from illegal activities. The legal theory behind this approach was novel and controversial. Prosecutors argued that the patch and logo weren't just symbols of membership, but were actually tools used to intimidate victims and facilitate criminal activities. According to this theory, when a Mongols member wore the patch while committing a crime, the reputation and fear associated with the organization became part of the criminal act itself. For the Mongols, this wasn't just a legal challenge, but an existential threat. Losing the right to use their patch and logo would effectively mean the end of the organization as they knew it. Members who had tattooed the logo on their bodies would potentially be carrying illegal symbols. Clubhouses displaying the patch could be subject to seizure. The psychological impact of losing these symbols would be devastating to an organization built on tradition and shared identity. Lil Dave threw himself into the defense effort with the determination of a man fighting for his life. He worked closely with the legal team, headed by attorney Joseph Yanni, to develop a strategy that would challenge both the specific criminal charges and the broader legal theory being used to attack the organization. The defense faced an uphill battle against prosecutors who had spent years building their case and had virtually unlimited resources at their disposal. The prosecution's case relied heavily on evidence gathered through years of surveillance, wiretapping, and undercover operations. They presented recordings of conversations between club members discussing criminal activities, financial records showing unexplained income, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who had been members of the organization. The volume of evidence was overwhelming, creating a narrative that painted the Mongols as a sophisticated criminal enterprise masquerading as a motorcycle club. Particularly damaging were recordings that seemed to show club leaders including Lil Dave, discussing criminal activities in coded language and making decisions about territorial disputes that resulted in violence. The prosecution argued that these conversations proved the existence of a command structure that directed criminal activity throughout the organization. The defense strategy focused on challenging the interpretation of this evidence and arguing that the government was conflating individual criminal behavior with organizational criminal activity. Yanni argued that while some Mongols members had undoubtedly committed crimes, this didn't prove that the organization itself was a criminal enterprise. Many legitimate organizations, he pointed out, had members who engaged in illegal activities without the organization's knowledge or approval. Throughout the trial, the relationship between Lil Dave and Agent Sun remained a subject of speculation and concern. Defense attorneys had to decide whether to call Sun as a witness, knowing that his testimony might reveal the extent of his communications with their client. The decision not to call Sun would later become a source of suspicion and controversy within the club. When the jury finally returned its verdict, the results were devastating for the Mongols. The organization was convicted on the RICO conspiracy charges, validating the government's theory that it was a criminal enterprise. The conviction carried not only criminal penalties, but also the potential forfeiture of the trademark and logo that was central to the club's identity. The $500,000 fine was significant but manageable for an organization that had members throughout the country. The real threat came from the civil forfeiture proceedings that would determine whether the government could seize the club's intellectual property. For the first time in American legal history, the federal government was attempting to essentially outlaw a motorcycle club by taking away its symbols and identity. But what Lil Dave didn't know was that his careful management of the defense strategy, including his communications with Agent Sun throughout the process, had created suspicions within his own organization that would prove far more dangerous than any government prosecution. When brothers turn against each other, the aftermath of the trial conviction created a pressure cooker environment within the Mongols organization. Members who had spent years dealing with surveillance and harassment from law enforcement now faced the additional stress of potentially losing their identity as a club. The reality of the situation was that every time they wore their patches or displayed club symbols, they were potentially violating federal law. This legal uncertainty created fertile ground for suspicion and paranoia. Members began questioning every aspect of the trial and the decisions made by leadership during the legal proceedings. The fact that certain witnesses weren't called, including Agent Sun, became a source of increasing concern. Some members wondered whether these decisions were made for sound legal reasons or whether there were other factors at play. Lil Dave found himself in an impossible position. As the leader of the organization, he bore responsibility for the legal strategy that had ultimately failed to prevent the conviction. Members looked to him for explanations about why certain defense decisions were made and what steps would be taken to appeal the verdict and fight the forfeiture proceedings. The stress of leading an organization under this level of legal and financial pressure began to take a personal toll on Lil Dave. The weight of responsibility for the entire club's future, combined with the constant threat of additional legal action, created an enormous psychological burden. Members and their families looked to him for reassurance and leadership during one of the most difficult periods in the club's history. Complicating matters further was the ongoing relationship between Lil Dave and Agent Sun. Even after the trial, the two men continued to have occasional contact, ostensibly related to ongoing legal matters and appeals. However, in the paranoid atmosphere following the conviction, any communication between the club's leader and the federal agent who had led the investigation was viewed with deep suspicion. The situation was made worse by the fact that many club members didn't fully understand the nature of the communications between Lil Dave and Sun. Without complete information about these interactions, members were left to speculate about what was being discussed and whether these conversations were appropriate for a club leader to be having with a federal agent. Some members began to question whether Lil Dave had been completely forthright about his communications with law enforcement during the trial. The decision not to call Agent Sun as a witness began to seem less like a strategic legal decision and more like an attempt to conceal potentially damaging information about the relationship between the two men. These suspicions were fueled by the natural tendency of people under stress to look for explanations for their problems. The conviction and its aftermath were devastating to the organization, and members needed someone to blame. Lil Dave, as the leader, was a natural target for this blame, but the suspicions went beyond normal accountability and into more dangerous territory. The outlaw motorcycle club culture has little tolerance for cooperation with law enforcement under any circumstances. The concept of being a rat or informant is viewed as the ultimate betrayal, worse than theft, violence, or any other transgression. Even the suggestion that a member might have cooperated with law enforcement is enough to result in expulsion from the club and potentially physical violence. In this environment, Lil Dave's communications with Agent Sun became a source of increasing concern and speculation. Members who had once viewed him as an effective leader began to wonder whether his effectiveness had come at the cost of inappropriate cooperation with the enemy. The fact that he had maintained communications with Sun even after the conviction seemed to confirm the worst suspicions of his critics within the organization. The growing tension within the club created an atmosphere where every decision Lil Dave made was viewed with suspicion. His attempts to manage the legal appeals process were questioned. His communications with attorneys were scrutinized. Even routine administrative decisions about club operations became sources of controversy and debate. This internal conflict was exactly what law enforcement agencies hoped to achieve through their prosecution strategy. By creating pressure and suspicion within the organization, they could potentially cause the club to destroy itself from within without the need for additional prosecutions or investigations. The success of this strategy became apparent as the Mongols began to tear themselves apart over questions about loyalty and leadership. What nobody knew was that the real explosion was still to come, not from law enforcement pressure or legal appeals, but from a personal betrayal so devastating that it would destroy everything Lil Dave had built in a single night. The night everything fell apart, Annie's revenge. Personal relationships in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs are complicated by the constant pressure and scrutiny that comes with the lifestyle. The wives and girlfriends of club members must deal with the stress of knowing their partners are always at risk of arrest, violence, or worse. They live with the knowledge that their homes might be raided, their communications monitored, and their children potentially affected by their partner's involvement with the club. For Annie Santillan, being married to the president of the Mongols meant dealing with all of these pressures while also managing the additional responsibilities that came with being the leader's wife. She was expected to maintain a certain image within the club community, support her husband's leadership, and handle the family's affairs while he dealt with club business and legal problems. The stress of the conviction and its aftermath put enormous strain on the Santillan marriage. Lil Dave was consumed with managing the club's legal and financial problems, leaving little time or emotional energy for his family relationships. The constant pressure and uncertainty about the future created tensions that even the strongest marriages would have struggled to handle. Annie's discovery of her husband's infidelity came at a time when she was already dealing with the maximum amount of stress from the club's legal problems. The betrayal of trust represented by his cheating was magnified by the fact that she had sacrificed so much to support his leadership of the organization. She had endured years of scrutiny, harassment, and worry, only to discover that he had been unfaithful during one of the most difficult periods of their marriage. The combination of personal betrayal and accumulated stress from years of pressure created a perfect storm of anger and resentment. Annie felt that she had given everything to support the club and her husband's leadership, only to be betrayed by the person she had sacrificed the most for. Her anger was not just about the infidelity itself, but about everything she had endured to support a man who had ultimately shown her such disrespect. Lil Dave's drinking problem made the situation even worse. Instead of dealing with the stress of the conviction and its aftermath in a constructive way, he had turned to alcohol as a way to cope with the pressure. This self-destructive behavior not only demonstrated poor judgment, but also made him vulnerable to making mistakes that could have serious consequences for both himself and the organization. The night of the recorded phone call, Lil Dave was drunk and emotionally vulnerable. The combination of alcohol and stress led him to say things that he would never have said under normal circumstances. His reference to Agent Sun's protection and the need for an exit strategy was exactly the kind of statement that could be interpreted as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. But what Lil Dave said during that drunken conversation would pale in comparison to what Annie decided to do with the recording. Her decision to record this conversation represented a moment of pure anger and desire for revenge. She wanted to hurt her husband in the most devastating way possible, and she understood that in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, nothing could be more damaging than accusations of cooperation with law enforcement. Annie's decision to share the recording with other club members was calculated to cause maximum damage to Lil Dave's reputation and position within the organization. But she didn't stop there. The text message calling him a rat was the nuclear option in the context of motorcycle club culture. Annie knew that this accusation would not just damage her husband's reputation, but would potentially put his life in danger. The text message was simple but devastating. In other words, he's a rat. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, there are no more dangerous words. Members of outlaw motorcycle clubs have been killed for less serious breaches of loyalty than being accused of cooperation with law enforcement. Her decision to take this step demonstrated the depth of her anger and hurt, but it also showed a lack of understanding of the potential consequences. Once the accusations were made public within the club, there would be no way to take them back or control how they were interpreted. The damage to Lil Dave's reputation would be permanent, regardless of whether the accusations were true or false. The irony of the situation was that Annie's actions accomplished exactly what years of federal investigation and prosecution had failed to achieve: the destruction of Lil Dave's leadership from within the organization. The government had spent millions of dollars and years of effort trying to dismantle the Mongols' leadership structure, but it was ultimately accomplished by a hurt and angry wife seeking revenge against her cheating husband. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned observers of motorcycle club politics and create a cascade of events that would destroy relationships, reputations, and lives. The expulsion. The process of expelling a member from an outlaw motorcycle club follows established protocols that are designed to ensure fairness and prevent hasty decisions based on temporary emotions or misunderstandings. These procedures are particularly important when dealing with accusations as serious as cooperation with law enforcement, since such charges can result in violence against the accused member if they are not handled properly. However, the emergency nature of Annie's accusations against Lil Dave created a situation where normal procedures were not followed. The combination of the shocking nature of the allegations and the existing tensions within the club following the conviction created an atmosphere where rational deliberation was difficult, if not impossible. The club's leadership called an emergency meeting to address the accusations. Under normal circumstances, such a meeting would include the accused member and would follow established procedures for investigating serious allegations. However, the explosive nature of the accusations and the fear that Lil Dave might be cooperating with ongoing law enforcement investigations created a sense of urgency that overrode normal procedures. The decision to hold the meeting without giving Lil Dave an opportunity to defend himself represented a fundamental breakdown in the club's internal justice system. For an organization that prided itself on loyalty and brotherhood, the failure to give their longtime leader a chance to address the accusations was a betrayal of their own stated values and principles. The recorded phone call provided what seemed like clear evidence of inappropriate communication with law enforcement. Lil Dave's references to Agent Sun's protection and the need for an exit strategy could easily be interpreted as evidence of cooperation with federal authorities. In the paranoid atmosphere following the conviction, club members were primed to believe the worst possible interpretation of these statements. Attorney Joseph Yanni played a crucial role in the expulsion process. His ongoing conflicts with Lil Dave over the handling of the trial gave him motivation to support the accusations against his former client. Yanni's legal expertise also lent credibility to the interpretation of the recorded statements as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. The speed with which the expulsion was carried out reflected the depth of fear and anger within the organization. Members who had followed Lil Dave's leadership for over a decade were suddenly willing to cast him out based on accusations that had not been thoroughly investigated or verified. The emotional impact of believing that their leader had betrayed them overwhelmed their rational judgment and their loyalty to a man who had served the organization faithfully for many years. The formal expulsion process involved stripping Lil Dave of his patch and removing him from all positions of authority within the organization. More significantly, it involved declaring him persona non grata within the entire motorcycle club community. This action effectively made him an outcast from the only community where he had found acceptance and purpose for most of his adult life. The psychological impact of expulsion from an outlaw motorcycle club cannot be overstated. For members who have built their entire identity around their participation in the organization, being cast out represents a form of social death. All of the relationships, activities, and sense of purpose that come with club membership are suddenly stripped away, leaving the expelled member isolated and adrift. For Lil Dave, the expulsion was particularly devastating because it came after he had dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to building and leading the organization. His entire adult identity was wrapped up in being a Mongol, and particularly in being the leader of the Mongols. The sudden loss of this identity left him without a clear sense of who he was or what his purpose in life should be. The timing of the expulsion also maximized its emotional impact. Coming in the aftermath of the conviction and during the ongoing appeals process, the loss of leadership removed Lil Dave's ability to continue fighting for the organization he had spent so many years building. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as others took control of the legal and political battles that would determine the club's future. The expulsion also had practical consequences that extended beyond the emotional damage. Lil Dave's extensive knowledge of club operations and his relationships with various legal and political contacts had been valuable assets in fighting the government's case. His removal from leadership eliminated these advantages at a time when the organization needed all the help it could get. Perhaps most significantly, the expulsion set a precedent within the organization that loyalty and long service could be discarded based on accusations and suspicions rather than proven facts. This development fundamentally changed the culture of the club and created an atmosphere where trust and security were replaced by paranoia and fear. But Lil Dave wasn't going to accept his fate quietly, and what he decided to do next would shock everyone involved and expose the truth about what had really happened. Fighting back. The legal battle for truth and reputation. The expulsion from the Mongols left Lil Dave in a unique and dangerous position. As a former leader of a major outlaw motorcycle club who had been accused of cooperation with law enforcement, he faced threats from multiple directions. Current club members viewed him as a traitor who deserved whatever punishment the criminal underworld typically reserved for informants. Law enforcement agencies saw him as a potential asset who might be willing to provide information in exchange for protection. Rather than accept his fate quietly or seek protection through cooperation with law enforcement, Lil Dave made the decision to fight back against the accusations that had destroyed his life. This choice required tremendous courage because it meant challenging the narrative that had been accepted by both the club and law enforcement agencies. By maintaining his innocence and demanding proof of the allegations against him, he was essentially calling his accusers liars and demanding that they provide evidence to support their claims. The legal strategy for fighting the accusations required a multi-pronged approach. First, it was necessary to challenge the interpretation of the recorded phone call that had been used as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. The statements that seemed to indicate cooperation needed to be placed in context and explained in a way that showed they did not actually constitute evidence of betrayal. Second, it was necessary to demonstrate that there was no documentary evidence of cooperation with law enforcement. Federal agencies maintain detailed records of their relationships with confidential informants, including formal agreements, payments, and reports of information provided. The absence of such documentation would be strong evidence that no formal cooperation relationship existed. Third, it was necessary to provide alternative explanations for the communications between Lil Dave and Agent Sun that had aroused suspicion within the club. These communications needed to be shown to have legitimate purposes that did not involve the sharing of confidential information or cooperation with law enforcement investigations. The decision to fight the accusations rather than accept them or flee represented a calculated gamble with potentially deadly consequences. If the legal strategy failed and the accusations were accepted as true by both the courts and the criminal community, Lil Dave would be in an even more dangerous position than before. However, if he could successfully challenge the accusations and prove his innocence, he might be able to restore his reputation and possibly even his position within the organization. The legal proceedings that followed would provide a forum for examining the evidence against Lil Dave in detail. Unlike the rushed internal club proceeding that had resulted in his expulsion, the court hearings would follow established procedures for examining evidence and would provide opportunities for cross-examination and the presentation of contradictory evidence. The stakes of these proceedings extended far beyond Lil Dave's personal reputation. The outcome would also determine whether the Mongols organization could use claims about his cooperation to overturn their conviction and avoid the forfeiture of their trademark and identity. If the accusations against Lil Dave were proven true, it would validate the club's decision to expel him, but would also confirm that their former leader had indeed betrayed them. If the accusations were proven false, it would mean that the organization had destroyed one of their most effective leaders based on lies and misunderstandings. The complexity of the legal situation was increased by the fact that multiple parties had different interests in the outcome. The federal government wanted to maintain their conviction and prevent any challenges based on claims of prosecutorial misconduct or the use of tainted evidence. The Mongols organization wanted to overturn their conviction, but also wanted to avoid admitting that they had wrongfully expelled their former leader. Lil Dave wanted to clear his name and restore his reputation, regardless of the impact on other parties. What nobody expected was that the truth, when it finally emerged in federal court, would be more shocking than anyone had imagined. The truth emerges: testimony and evidence in federal court. Judge David Carter's courtroom became the arena where years of accusations, suspicions, and conflicting narratives would finally be subjected to rigorous examination under oath. The hearing that would determine the truth about Lil Dave's alleged cooperation with law enforcement brought together witnesses from across the spectrum of the case: federal agents, club members, attorneys, and family members who had been at the center of the controversy. The testimony of ATF Supervisory Special Agent Susan Rachel provided the first crucial piece of evidence. Her unequivocal statement that Lil Dave was not a confidential informant carried significant weight because of her position within the agency and her access to all relevant records. Federal agencies maintain meticulous documentation of their relationships with informants because of the legal and financial obligations involved in these relationships. The absence of any such documentation provided strong evidence that no formal cooperation agreement existed. Agent Rachel's testimony was supported by similar statements from other law enforcement officers who had been involved in the investigation. Officer Omar Rodriguez, Deputy Ivana Fars, and Sergeant Jared Lewis all testified that their thorough searches of law enforcement databases had found no records indicating that Lil Dave had ever served as an informant or cooperating witness. This testimony was particularly significant because it came from officers representing different agencies and jurisdictions, providing independent confirmation of the same conclusion. FBI Special Agent Joey Talamantes added another crucial element to the testimony by addressing specific claims that had been made about Lil Dave's status in the investigation. His statement that Lil Dave was not an unidentified co-conspirator directly contradicted claims that had been used to support the accusations against the former club leader. This testimony helped to demolish the foundation of suspicion that had been built around Lil Dave's role in the federal investigation. The testimony of Stephen Stubbs, one of the defense attorneys who had represented the Mongols during their trial, provided insight into the communications between Lil Dave and Agent Sun that had aroused so much suspicion. Stubbs confirmed that Lil Dave had told him about meeting with Sun, but characterized these communications as efforts to manage tensions and prevent violence, rather than information sharing or cooperation with the investigation. This testimony was crucial because it provided a legitimate explanation for the communications that had been interpreted as evidence of cooperation. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, preventing violence through communication with law enforcement can be seen as responsible leadership rather than betrayal, especially when it protects club members from potential harm. But the most dramatic testimony came from Annie Santillan herself, who recanted her previous accusations against her husband. Her admission that she had lied about Lil Dave being an informant because she was angry about his infidelity provided a clear explanation for the origin of the accusations that had destroyed his leadership. This testimony was particularly powerful because Annie had been the original source of the accusations and had no obvious motivation to lie in court to protect her estranged husband. Annie's testimony revealed the human drama that had been hidden behind the legal and organizational conflicts. Her description of the emotional pain and anger that had led her to make false accusations helped explain how personal relationships and family conflicts had become entangled with serious criminal allegations. The fact that she was willing to admit publicly that she had lied demonstrated both the strength of the evidence supporting Lil Dave's innocence and her recognition of the serious consequences her actions had caused. The testimony about the recorded phone call that had been central to the accusations required careful analysis to separate inflammatory language from actual evidence of cooperation. Expert witnesses and attorneys helped explain how statements made during emotional, alcohol-influenced conversations could be misinterpreted when taken out of context. The references to protection and exit strategies that had seemed so damning were shown to have alternative explanations that did not require assuming cooperation with law enforcement. Agent Sun's own testimony, when it finally came, provided additional confirmation that no cooperation relationship existed. His description of his communications with Lil Dave emphasized the professional rather than conspiratorial nature of their interactions. While acknowledging that he had developed a working relationship with the club leader, he denied that this relationship involved the sharing of confidential information or cooperation with the investigation. The cumulative effect of all this testimony was to create a clear picture that contradicted the accusations that had destroyed Lil Dave's leadership. Multiple independent sources confirmed that no evidence existed to support claims that he had cooperated with law enforcement. The original source of the accusations admitted that she had lied. Alternative explanations were provided for the communications and statements that had aroused suspicion. What emerged from the courtroom was a tragic story of an organization that had destroyed one of its most effective leaders, based on false accusations, personal vendettas, and misunderstandings that could have been avoided if cooler heads had prevailed. Justice delayed, but not denied, the court's decision. Judge Carter faced an extraordinarily complex situation in evaluating the evidence presented during the hearing. The accusations against Lil Dave had triggered a chain of events that affected not only his personal life, but also the legal status of an entire organization and the validity of a major federal prosecution. The judge needed to determine not just whether the accusations were true, but also what legal consequences should follow from his findings. The standard of evidence required for different aspects of the case added to the complexity of the judge's task. For the Mongols' organization to succeed in their claim that prosecutorial misconduct had occurred, they would need to prove not just that Lil Dave had been an informant, but that the government had used information from him inappropriately and had failed to disclose this relationship to the defense. For Lil Dave to clear his name, he needed to prove that the accusations against him were false. The judge's analysis of the testimony and evidence was thorough and methodical. He examined each piece of evidence that had been used to support the accusations against Lil Dave and evaluated whether it actually supported the conclusions that had been drawn from it. The recorded phone call was analyzed in detail, with careful attention to the context in which the statements were made and the various ways they could be interpreted. The testimony from federal agents was given significant weight because of their professional obligations to maintain accurate records and their lack of obvious motivation to lie about whether Lil Dave had been an informant. The consistency of their testimony across multiple agencies and jurisdictions strengthened the credibility of their statements. Annie's recantation of her accusations was evaluated carefully, with attention to her motivations for both making the original accusations and later admitting they were false. The judge had to determine whether her court testimony was more credible than her original accusations. Taking into account the emotional circumstances surrounding both statements, the judge's decision that insufficient evidence existed to prove that Lil Dave had been a government informant was based on the complete absence of documentation that would be expected to exist if such a relationship had existed. Federal agencies maintain detailed records of their relationships with informants for legal and administrative reasons, and the absence of any such records provided strong evidence that no formal cooperation had occurred. However, the judge's decision was carefully worded to avoid completely exonerating Lil Dave or completely condemning the Mongols for their actions in expelling him. The decision focused on the legal question of whether enough evidence existed to overturn the organization's conviction based on claims of prosecutorial misconduct, rather than making broader judgments about the personal or organizational conflicts involved. The denial of a new trial for the Mongols meant that their conviction would stand, and that the forfeiture proceedings against their trademark and logo would continue. This outcome represented a victory for the government's prosecution strategy and confirmed that the evidence presented during the original trial was sufficient to support the conviction, regardless of questions about Lil Dave's alleged cooperation. For Lil Dave personally, the judge's decision provided partial vindication by confirming that no evidence existed to support the accusations that had destroyed his leadership. However, this legal vindication came too late to restore his position within the organization or repair the relationships that had been damaged by the controversy. The decision also highlighted the tragic nature of the entire situation. An organization had destroyed one of its most effective leaders based on accusations that proved to be unfounded. Personal conflicts and family problems had been allowed to interfere with rational decision-making, resulting in consequences that harmed everyone involved. The Mongols' organization found themselves in the position of having expelled a leader who had not actually betrayed them, while still facing the legal and financial consequences of their conviction. They had lost the benefit of his leadership during one of the most difficult periods in their history, based on false accusations and misunderstandings. For Lil Dave, the vindication was bittersweet. While his reputation had been legally cleared, the damage to his personal relationships and his position within the motorcycle club community was irreversible. The organization he had dedicated his life to building and leading had cast him out based on lies, and there was no way to undo that betrayal or restore what had been lost. The case stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal conflicts and emotions to override rational judgment, especially in high-stakes situations where reputations, livelihoods, and even lives hang in the balance. It demonstrates how quickly decades of loyalty and service can be destroyed by false accusations, and how difficult it can be to repair the damage once it has been done. Even when the truth finally emerges, the story of Lil Dave and the Mongols serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating attacks come not from external enemies, but from within, and that the bonds of brotherhood and loyalty that hold organizations together can be more fragile than they appear.